Hey guys, this slide deck and little video is going to tell you about another chemical reaction called cellular respiration. And it is how cells convert the food that they take in or the food that they make, in the case of plant cells, into ATP energy, which if you remember, ATP is the molecule that all cells need to do everything, especially to stay alive. Now, cellular respiration, as I said a few seconds ago, is another example of a chemical reaction that you need to memorize. What makes this a little wonderful is cellular respiration is just photosynthesis backwards. So you'll see here that the reactants for cellular respiration are glucose, C6H12O6, okay, and oxygen. And the products for cellular respiration are carbon dioxide, water, and some energy, okay? Those are exactly the opposites of photosynthesis. If you remember in photosynthesis, we could make this back into photosynthesis by changing reactants into products and products into reactants and changing this ATP energy into light. Okay, so if we make those changes, cellular respiration becomes photosynthesis. Photosynthesis. Okay, and we're not talking a mitochondrion here, we are talking about a chloroplast. Okay, so there is a strong connection between cellular respiration and photosynthesis. It's really helpful to understand that. Okay, now cellular respiration is also known as aerobic respiration. And you probably have heard the word aerobic before in reference to exercise. Aerobic means needs oxygen. So whenever you hear about something being aerobic, that's just a way of scientifically saying or expressing that oxygen is required. So calling it aerobic respiration refers to the fact that the reactant needed for cellular respiration is oxygen. Now, cellular respiration, if we break it down visually, I want you guys to imagine a mitochondrion. Okay, it's sitting inside of the cytoplasm of its cell, and it's going to take in two things. It's going to take in oxygen from the environment, and it's going to take in food molecules like glucose from the environment. Now, this food molecule could be a glucose, it could be fructose, it could be another carbohydrate like a starch, it could be a lipid, it could be a fat, like fats and oils and things like that. All the things that you consume that contain calories can be broken down by cellular respiration to make ATP energy. So it isn't just glucose. Glucose is the simplest though, and it's the one that we see most often when people talk about cellular respiration. Now those two things go in, and the products that come out are carbon dioxide, which is a waste gas. Okay, that's why you have to exhale to get rid of that. ATP energy, which is what you want, okay, that's what cells need to stay alive. And also, as a byproduct, you get some heat energy. So whenever cellular respiration is happening inside of cells, it's generating a little bit of heat too. And this is where all of your body heat is coming from, which is kind of cool. So that's why we're warm. So anything that is alive is going to be generating a little bit of heat just because it's making ATP energy. Now this is the chemical reaction for cellular respiration, and it's balanced. And you'll see here we have our reactants, as always, on the left. We have our products on the right, and you'll see that one glucose molecule, and 6 oxygen molecules are needed to make some ATP, some 6 water molecules, and 6 carbon dioxide molecules. Now I added in heat here just to be complete, because anytime that you break down a food molecule, you're going to generate a little bit of heat too. All right, so if you notice, if we reverse the arrow and go this way, 6 carbon dioxides plus 6 waters plus light energy makes glucose and oxygen. We have photosynthesis, which is what we talked about last time. So cellular respiration as a reaction is just photosynthesis flipped around backwards. Now notice that oxygen is required as a reactant here. I just can't stress this enough. This is what makes this an aerobic chemical reaction. It only happens in the presence of oxygen. Okay. Now you probably have heard that people die pretty quickly when they can't get air. Well, that's because your brain will run out of oxygen in about 5 minutes if your breathing stops. That means your body will use up all of the oxygen that's currently in your bloodstream. And since no more is being put in your bloodstream, the brain will die. And unfortunately, brain tissue cannot be regenerated. So once your brain is dead, whatever it is that makes up you is also gone. So this is called brain death. And the reason why the brain as a tissue dies is because it cannot live second to second without a constant supply of ATP, which it is making by doing cellular respiration. So I really wanted to reinforce with you guys that this is what keeps us alive. This is what happens constantly as our body breaks down the sugar in our blood, because that glucose, that blood glucose, is literally the fuel that's keeping everything going. Now, this is a review. I know we've talked about this before. This is called the ATP cycle. And in this picture, you can see how ATP can be changed into ADP. So down here at the bottom, this part here at the bottom, this is ADP. Okay? So when you change ATP up here at the top into ADP, you take energy out. And that is the energy that cells use to stay alive and to grow and to reproduce and to do all the things they need to do. But in order to make more ADP, you've got to put energy back in. And that energy is coming from the food you ate. So over here, this part here where this energy is going in, this is cellular respiration. Cellular respiration happens to make ATP. And I'm hoping this diagram, by putting it here, will review with you guys how ATP is made from ADP, but you can only do that when there's energy coming in from somewhere. Now, it could be from cellular respiration, or it could be from photosynthesis, but this is how life regenerates the ATP that it needs to stay alive. All right, now, cellular respiration actually happens in a whole bunch of different steps. For this class, you guys only really need to be aware of 2 steps. The first step is called glycolysis, and the word glycolysis literally means lysis, to break, glyco, which is glucose. So the word literally means to break glucose. So the first step of glycolysis is when glucose is broken down into 2 molecules of pyruvate. Literally, the glucose gets split in half. Now, this process takes place in the cytoplasm and is performed by glycolysis enzymes. All known living cells do this, and this is how they convert glucose into pyruvate. And when they do this, they get a little bit of ATP payoff for this. And the beauty of glycolysis is it is anaerobic. That means that you can do this without oxygen. So the first step of cellular respiration does not require oxygen, and it happens in the cytoplasm of all cells, and it makes a little bit of ATP. Now, glycolysis is how many cells make their living. There are lots of living things called bacteria that only do glycolysis. So they make all the ATP they need just by doing this first step. Now, mitochondria finish the breaking down process of pyruvate by breaking the pyruvate down into carbon dioxide and water. So mitochondria finish this process, and that's the second step. So let's examine what we just talked about visually, which for me, I'm a visual person. This is a little easier for me to see. So we're going to start with some glucose out in the environment. All right. Now the cell is going to take this glucose in because glucose is literally its fuel. Okay. So we're going to take that glucose into the cytoplasm. So now we have some glucose molecules floating around in the cytoplasm. Now notice they haven't done anything yet with the mitochondria. Okay, what's going to happen first in the cytoplasm is that glucose is going to be broken down into pyruvate. Now you're going to get a couple pyruvate molecules from this and a little bit of ATP, a few ATPs. This process is called glycolysis, and it happens in the cytoplasm outside of the mitochondria. Now what's going to happen next is the mitochondria are going to finish breaking down those pyruvates into carbon dioxide and water and producing a lot more ATPs. Okay? So what's going to happen next is those pyruvates are going to go into the mitochondria. Now the mitochondria cannot do anything with these pyruvates unless there is oxygen available. So we need 6 oxygen molecules in order to break down these pyruvates. And that's going to happen inside the mitochondria. Okay, next, you're going to get some carbon dioxide produced, and we're going to get some water produced, some H2O. Okay, squeeze that in there. And the beauty of it is you're going to get about 30 ATPs. So aerobic respiration, or the second part of cellular respiration that happens in mitochondria, produces a whopping 30 ATP molecules per glucose molecule. And that's a huge payoff. So evolutionarily, cells that have mitochondria can get a lot more bang out of their glucose than cells like bacteria that can only break it down using glycolysis. Okay, that's a pretty hefty idea to digest, if you'll forgive the pun here. You get a big payoff, but in order for this to happen, you have to be able to breathe oxygen or take in oxygen. So there are lots of bacteria that can do glycolysis in places where there is no oxygen. And that's going to be important if you consider studying biology and you learn about the weird bacteria that live in places where we can't live. All right, that's the end of this presentation. Thank you for listening, and I hope it made sense.